Cancel culture totalitarianism. At Morgan Stanley, I'm eating a $200 Wagyu sandwich for lunch while simultaneously monitoring my crypto positions and scrolling through Twitter when I see that Bradley fucking Harrison has been completely destroyed. Bradley Harrison, who went to Yale with me and pledged the same fraternity and now works at Goldman managing pension fund portfolios worth approximately $3 billion, has been obliterated by the digital mob because someone found a 20-year-old photo of him at a Halloween party wearing what the woke Inquisition has determined to be cultural appropriation. The photo shows Bradley at 22 years old dressed as a samurai. Just a white guy wearing a costume that celebrates Japanese warrior culture, which he would think would be considered respectful appreciation rather than some kind of hate crime. But in 2025 everything is a hate crime if you're white and male and successful and refuse to prostrate yourself before the altar of perpetual victimhood that has replaced actual religion in our godless society. The Twitter thread exposing Bradley has already been retweeted 47,000 times with comments like, "This is literally violence against Asian communities," and "White supremacy is embedded in every costume choice," and my personal favorite, "Goldman Sachs needs to fire this racist immediately or face boycotts." These people have turned moral outrage into a full-time career, and they're better at destroying lives than most people are at their actual jobs. I knew Bradley in college and he's not racist. He's barely even interesting enough to have controversial opinions about anything. The man collects stamps and plays golf, and his idea of rebellion is ordering his steak medium instead of medium rare. But none of that matters because the mob has decided he's a symbol of systemic oppression, and symbols must be destroyed to satisfy the bloodlust of people whose entire identity revolves around finding new things to be offended by. What makes this particularly hilarious is that the person who originally posted the photo is this blue-haired gender studies major named Alex, who uses they/them pronouns and has "eat the rich" in their bio while simultaneously living off a trust fund established by their grandfather's oil fortune. Alex has never worked a real job or contributed anything meaningful to society, but they have 200,000 followers who hang on their every word about social justice and economic inequality because hypocrisy is a virtue in the oppression Olympics. The pile-on is brutal and methodical. First came the Twitter thread with the original photo and a detailed analysis of how Bradley's costume represents the fetishization of Asian masculinity by white colonizers. Then came the Instagram posts with crying selfies from various activists explaining how triggered they are by this violence. Then came the TikTok videos with teenage girls dancing while holding signs that say Goldman Sachs supports racism, because everything must be turned into content for people whose attention spans have been destroyed by social media algorithms. Within 6 hours, Goldman's HR department has issued a statement saying they are deeply concerned by these allegations and are conducting a thorough investigation into this matter. Which is corporate speak for, "We're going to fire this guy as soon as legally possible to avoid any negative publicity that might affect our stock price." The statement also includes the usual boilerplate about their commitment to diversity and inclusion and their zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, even though their executive leadership is still 90% white men who went to the same prep schools and Ivy League universities. Bradley releases his own statement 6 hours later through what is obviously a crisis management firm hired by Goldman's legal department. The statement hits all the required notes. "I sincerely apologize for my thoughtless actions 20 years ago. I recognize that my costume choice was hurtful and offensive to the Asian American community. I am committed to doing the work to educate myself about the impact of cultural appropriation and to becoming a better ally in the fight against racism and xenophobia." The language is so perfectly calibrated to appease the mob that you know it was written by professionals who specialize in crafting apologies for rich people who've been caught violating the ever-changing rules of acceptable behavior. But apologies don't work anymore because the mob isn't interested in forgiveness or education or personal growth. They're interested in destruction because destruction gives them a sense of power that they can't achieve through actual accomplishment. The comments on Bradley's apology are predictably savage. "This is just more white supremacist gaslighting. He's only sorry he got caught. Apologies are just violence in disguise. Goldman Sachs needs to fire him today or we'll assume they support racism." These people have turned victimhood into an art form, and they're not going to let something like a sincere apology interfere with their performance. What's really fucking hilarious is watching other finance bros desperately distance themselves from Bradley through their own social media posts. Guys I know who have said far worse things in private are suddenly posting Instagram stories about their solidarity with the Asian American community and their commitment to confronting racism in all its forms. The same people who make jokes about diversity hires and complain about affirmative action in private are now competing to demonstrate their anti-racist credentials in public. Marcus Wellington III posts a LinkedIn article titled, "Why We Must Do Better," where he reflects on his own journey of understanding regarding cultural appropriation and systemic racism. The article gets 3,000 likes and hundreds of comments praising his courage and leadership, even though everyone in our industry knows that Marcus thinks diversity initiatives are reverse discrimination and refers to female colleagues as the girls when he thinks no one is listening. The feeding frenzy continues for 3 days with new revelations about Bradley's problematic past being uncovered by amateur investigators who have turned cancellation into a competitive sport. Someone finds his college thesis, which included a footnote that referenced a book by an author who has since been determined to be racist. Someone else discovers that he once liked a Facebook post that linked to an article that quoted someone who made a joke that could be interpreted as transphobic if you squint hard enough. Each new revelation generates its own wave of outrage and fresh calls for his termination. The mob has created an entire mythology around Bradley where he becomes a symbol of white male privilege and institutional racism rather than just some boring guy who wore a stupid costume 2 decades ago. They've turned him into the villain in their personal narrative about fighting oppression, even though most of them have never experienced actual oppression beyond having their Starbucks order spelled wrong. Goldman finally fires him on Friday afternoon with a statement saying they've concluded their investigation and determined that Bradley's actions were inconsistent with our values and commitment to creating an inclusive workplace. They also announce a new mandatory training program on cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias because nothing says, "We're taking this seriously," like forcing employees to sit through PowerPoint presentations about microaggressions and privilege checking. The mob celebrates Bradley's destruction like they've just won a major victory against fascism. Twitter is full of congratulatory posts about accountability and consequences and justice being served. These people have convinced themselves that ruining someone's career over a 20-year-old photo is somehow equivalent to fighting the civil rights movement or resisting Nazi Germany. But here's what they don't understand about how the world actually works. Bradley will be fine because people like Bradley are always fine. His family has connections and money, and within 6 months he'll have a better job at a smaller firm that doesn't give a shit about Twitter mobs. The people who destroyed him will move on to their next target and forget he ever existed because their attention span is measured in news cycles rather than actual human consequences. Meanwhile, Goldman continues making billions of dollars by manipulating global financial markets and bribing politicians and exploiting developing nations, but nobody cares about that because actual systemic problems are too complicated for people whose political analysis comes from TikTok videos. It's easier to focus on costume choices and pronouns and microaggressions because those problems can be solved by destroying individuals rather than confronting institutional power structures that require actual work to change. The real genius of cancel culture is how it's channeled legitimate anger about inequality into a mechanism for preserving the status quo. Instead of organizing labor unions or demanding wealth redistribution or challenging corporate power, people spend their energy policing language and destroying middle-class professionals who make the mistake of violating arbitrary social codes. The ruling class loves this shit because it keeps the peasants fighting each other instead of recognizing who their real enemies are. I finished my Wagyu sandwich and checked Bradley's LinkedIn profile, which now shows that he's seeking new opportunities, which is professional speak for unemployable thanks to the digital lynch mob. His profile picture still shows him smiling at some charity gala because he hasn't figured out yet that his old life is over and he needs to completely reinvent himself if he wants to survive in this new world where your past is always available for weaponization by people who hate you for reasons you'll never understand. The funniest part is that I'm completely immune to this kind of destruction because I understand how the game actually works. Cancel culture only affects people who play by the rules and believe in the legitimacy of the system. People who apologize and try to reason with the mob and hope that sincerity will save them from digital execution. But I don't apologize for anything because apologies are admissions of guilt, and guilt is a social construct designed to control people who are stupid enough to believe in objective morality. If someone tried to cancel me, I would double down and triple down and make them regret ever hearing my name. I would hire private investigators to dig up dirt on my accusers and use my financial resources to destroy them more thoroughly than they could ever destroy me. I would turn their own tactics against them and show them what real power looks like when it's wielded by someone who doesn't care about social approval or moral legitimacy. But they'll never come for me because I'm too smart to leave evidence of wrongthings scattered across social media platforms and too wealthy to be vulnerable to economic pressure from activist campaigns. Cancel culture is for middle-class professionals who depend on corporate employment and social media validation. People like me exist in a different ecosystem where money and connections provide immunity from the moral panics that destroy ordinary people. I open a new browser tab and check Bradley's Twitter account, which has been deactivated because his crisis management team told him that staying online would just provide more opportunities for his enemies to humiliate him. Smart move, but also pathetic because it means the mob has successfully driven another person out of the public square and claimed another scalp in their ongoing war against free expression and individual autonomy. This is what democracy looks like in 2025. Not debates or elections or constitutional processes, but mob rule enforced through social media platforms owned by billionaire tech moguls who profit from the chaos and division that keeps people distracted from their own exploitation. The mob thinks they're fighting fascism, but they're actually implementing it through decentralized authoritarian tactics that would make Stalin jealous. The beautiful irony is that most of the people participating in cancel culture are exactly the kind of weak-minded conformists who would have enthusiastically supported whatever political system happened to be in power throughout history. They're not brave resistance fighters standing up to oppression. They're the same people who would have reported their Jewish neighbors to the Gestapo or denounced their co-workers to the Committee for State Security or burned witches in Salem because they lack the intellectual courage to think independently about complex moral questions. They've turned virtue signaling into a competitive sport where the goal is to demonstrate your moral superiority by destroying people who violate the constantly shifting rules of acceptable behavior. But virtue without power is just masturbation, and power without virtue is just tyranny, and what we have now is the worst of both worlds, where powerless people exercise tyrannical authority over arbitrary moral codes that change based on whatever generates the most engagement on social media platforms. I close the browser tab and return to my crypto trading dashboard, where I've made another $50,000 while the mob was busy destroying Bradley's life. This is the difference between people like me and people like them. They spend their energy on symbolic victories that generate emotional satisfaction but produce no material results. I spend my energy on activities that generate actual wealth and power, which can be used to shape reality according to my preferences. Cancel culture is the perfect distraction for a society that's too stupid to recognize its real problems and too weak to solve them if it could. Keep the peasants fighting over pronouns and costume choices while the ruling class loots the treasury and destroys the environment and starts wars for profit. Keep them focused on individual moral failures while institutional corruption continues unchecked. Keep them believing that destroying random middle-class professionals is somehow equivalent to challenging systemic injustice. It's fucking brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Create a moral panic that channels legitimate grievances into destructive but ultimately harmless activities that don't threaten the interests of people who actually matter. Convince the victims of exploitation that their real enemies are other victims rather than their exploiters. Turn every social interaction into a potential minefield where one wrong word can destroy your life and livelihood. The best part is that the people who support cancel culture think they're being progressive and revolutionary when they're actually enforcing the most conservative social dynamic imaginable: absolute conformity to arbitrary authority backed by the threat of complete social and economic destruction. They've created a system where everyone must constantly monitor their thoughts and words and behaviors to avoid triggering the unpredictable rage of an anonymous digital mob that operates according to rules that change without notice. This is why people like me will always win and people like them will always lose. They're fighting phantom enemies while real enemies rob them blind. They're policing language while their economic security disappears. They're demanding justice while justice becomes whatever generates the most clicks and shares on platforms designed to monetize human suffering. Bradley's destruction is already yesterday's news because the mob has found a fresh target to destroy. Some corporate executive made a joke about pronouns during a Zoom call, and now the cycle begins again with the same predictable stages: outrage, investigation, apology, destruction, celebration, and then the search for the next victim. It's an industrial process for manufacturing righteousness and consuming human lives for entertainment. I check my portfolio one more time before the market closes and see that I've gained another $73,000 today while contributing absolutely nothing to society except financial manipulation and market volatility. But according to the logic of cancel culture, I'm morally superior to Bradley Harrison because I've never worn a culturally inappropriate costume or made any public statements that violate current orthodoxy about race and gender and sexuality. This is the world we've created, where moral worth is determined by adherence to arbitrary social codes rather than actual behavior or consequences. Where destroying someone's career over a 20-year-old photo is considered justice, but destroying someone's retirement savings through financial fraud is just business. Where symbolic gestures matter more than material reality and performance matters more than substance. The mob has moved on to their next target, but Bradley's life is still ruined and will remain ruined because the internet never forgets, and forgiveness is not part of the cancel culture operating system. He'll spend the next decade trying to rebuild his reputation and career while his destroyers have already forgotten his name, because destroying people is just content for them, not a matter of justice or accountability. This is what happens when you mistake social media for reality and activism for entertainment. You get a system that's perfectly designed to destroy individuals while preserving the institutions that actually matter. You get justice theater performed by people who have never experienced actual injustice and consumed by people who mistake emotional satisfaction for political progress. And people like me just keep getting richer and more powerful while everyone else fights over the scraps of moral authority in a rigged game that was designed to distract them from the real game, where all the actual decisions get made by people they'll never meet and can't cancel, because cancellation only works on people who need social approval to survive. The market closes and I've made another $112,000 today while Bradley Harrison updates his resume and wonders how his life got destroyed by a photo he forgot existed until the mob decided to weaponize it against him. Tomorrow the mob will find someone new to destroy and the cycle will continue, and nothing will actually change except that one more person will have learned that conformity is the price of survival in our brave new world of democratized authoritarianism.